also snacks in the back, so feel free to have snacks and water. And then if you guys want some chairs, there's some chairs in the place so you don't have to stand the whole time. Before I begin, I just want to take a few moments to thank a few people in the audience. First off, I'd like to thank Nicole for introducing me. Second off, I'd like to thank my parents for being amazing, for all their love and printer ink. I would also like to thank my Thesis advisor, especially for being extremely generous for his time. And last of all, I'd also like to thank my sister Andrea for being extremely supportive. Before I begin, I also would like to outline a few sections of my thesis. So first off, the title of my thesis is Education, the Injustice of Ignorance and Self-Government in Frederick Douglass's Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. These three are sort of overarching themes within my thesis. My thesis is also divided into three sections. In part one, I will discuss Douglass's education and the cultivation of his intellectual freedom. In part two, I will discuss the cultivation of his virtuous freedom and how that builds up on his education. And in part two, I will discuss political freedom and how his intellectual freedom and his virtuous freedom led him to his political freedom. So during the periods of American slavery, the Civil War, and of the Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass gained an international reputation as an abolitionist. He impressed thousands with his speeches against racial prejudice and supporting women's suffrage. Douglass's unprecedented leadership in the anti-slavery movement refuted the widely held notion of the slaveholders of his time that slaves lacked the intellectual capacities to behave like American citizens. Today, Douglass continues to be one of America's most renowned intellectuals. However, Frederick Douglass's legacy began with the experiences of his life as a slave. Douglass was born a slave in February of 1818. He escaped from slavery and became a freeman in February of 1830. He passed away on February, which is today's date, if you guys don't know, of 1895. Following his escape from slavery, one of the most prominent features of Douglass's legacy was his powerful autobiography about this particular time of his life as a slave. In his narrative, Douglass describes his life as a country and city slave, his attempt to escape from slavery, as well as his new life in New Bedford as a free man. Although his book is renowned as a testimony to the horrors of slavery and is praised for his arguments against it, by articulating the injustices of slavery, Douglass also provides a very insightful account about human nature and about the human good. Douglass's narrative teaches us that the grossest and most dehumanizing aspect of slavery is ignorance. Through Douglass's experiences, the book reveals how the slave masters degraded the rational faculties and human qualities of their slaves, such as their ability to cultivate virtue. As Douglass presents these injustices to his readers, he provokes us to think about the dangers of education, the importance as well as the meaning of cultivating intellectual and virtuous freedom. Finally, the most important thing that we learn from Douglass's narrative is that true freedom is political freedom. Part 1. Douglass spent his childhood living on Colonel White's plantation in the Maryland countryside from the time he was born till the time he was about 8 years old. Afterwards, Douglass was sent to live and work for Hugh and Sophia Auld in the city of Baltimore. According to Douglass, his departure from Colonel White's plantation was a significant and providential circumstance because he recognized that it eventually led him to his deliverance. When Douglass arrived in Baltimore, Sophia Auld, his new mistress, taught Douglass the alphabet, as well as how to read and write very simple four-letter words. However, Hugh Auld forbade Sophia from teaching Douglass. As readers, we understand that learning to read and write was a very, very unique circumstance for Douglass, especially when Hugh Auld articulates the reasons why slaves were uneducated. First, the reader learns that teaching the slave is unlawful. Second, Hugh Auld states that a slave should only learn obedience. In his words, education would spoil the best slave in the world, since the slave would become unmanageable and of no use to his master. Moreover, Hugh Auld explains that an educated slave would be discontented and unhappy. When Douglass heard these words, they unintentionally allowed him to understand the white man's power to enslave the black man and the pathway from slavery to freedom. Douglass's experiences with the Auld family teach us that ignorance is a form of slavery. By recounting Hugh Auld's rationale and the arguments against the slave's education, Douglass reveals that the slave masters intentionally ensured the ignorance of their slaves. As a result, slaves were easily managed and used by their slave masters. Later in his narrative, when Douglas discusses the problems of drunkenness among the slaves, he comments on the injustice of ignorance. He writes, "I have found that to make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and as far as possible to emulate the power of reason." Here, Douglas's statement about a contented slave echoes Hugh All's insight that an educated slave will become unhappy. However, Douglas also understood that his education had the power to cultivate his intellectual freedom. Furthermore, as readers, we learn from both insights why education is the antidote to the disease of ignorance. Education leads to intellectual freedom. As a result, Hugh All's opposition to Douglas's education only motivated Douglas to continue his education. So one of the ways in which Douglas continued to read and even write was that Douglas would come up to the street children and he would ask them to teach him certain words and phrases. And he even writes that he would even trade away his food for a very beautiful phrase, the more valuable bread of knowledge. While Douglas did not have much time for leisure, he found time to read books in between his chores and his errands. According to Douglas, out of all the books that he read, the Columbian Order had the most profound effect on Douglas. In this book, he encountered a dialogue between a master and a slave, which allowed him to realize the bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. The education of Douglas eventually gave him the knowledge about the injustice of his condition as a slave. This knowledge, which Douglas received through his experiences with the Auld family and from reading the Columbian Order, affirmed two potential dangers that are caused by knowledge. First, when the slave master uses knowledge without virtue, he maintains his slaves, whom he recognizes as rational human beings, ignorant for the sake of their enslavement. An ignorant slave is easier to manage and use because he is not asking questions about the justice of his enslavement. He's not thinking about his dignity as a human, and therefore, he's not attempting to escape. Second, Douglas's education made him depressed. In knowing the arguments about the unjust nature of slavery, Douglas felt hopeless and even entertained suicidal thoughts. Douglas even admits that at the time he viewed learning how to read and write as a curse rather than a blessing. Despite his sufferings, Douglas was determined to pursue his freedom because he understood that slavery was unjust. As mentioned above, Douglas knew that education was necessary for intellectual freedom and was the pathway to political freedom. Douglas's painful and almost bitter reaction to his education poses a serious obstacle and paradox to intellectual freedom. The truth is painful, yet without the truth, Douglas would have lacked his ardent desire and rigorous determination to escape from slavery. Part 2. After Douglas's master, Captain Anthony, died, Douglas was ultimately left in the possession of Thomas Auld. As a slaveholder, Thomas Auld thought that city life had a pernicious effect upon Douglas, so he sent Douglas to work on Edward Covey's farm. Mr. Covey, although he was a relatively poor farmer and was known for breaking in slaves, in particular, Mr. Covey's forte consisted in his power to deceive. At first, Douglas attempted to resist being broken by Mr. Covey, but after many months of constant work and living in fear of Mr. Covey's deception and cunning, Douglas was eventually broken. Not only was Douglas physically exhausted, but he also lost his determination to continue to read. Douglas admits that he was transformed into a brute. Instead of exercising his intellectual capacities, Douglas spent his leisure days, Sundays, in a sort of beast-like stupor. However, two instances helped Douglas overcome his slavish and brutish state. First, Douglas provides the reader with a rhetorical and dramatic monologue where he questions God's existence and the reason for his enslavement. So he says something along the lines of, why am I born a slave? Why is God allowing me to go through this? So first he invokes God and says, God, can you please deliver me? But then he questions whether God exists. And then he tells himself, I'm going to run away. I'm not going to live like this anymore. Douglas's monologue, despite its rhetorical character, indicates that Douglas's natural longing for justice strengthened his determination to pursue his freedom. His monologue was also an attempt to reconcile the injustice of his enslavement. Douglas's unjust existence as a slave led him to desperately cry out for God's help. Douglas understood that his own suffering was caused by an institution that was morally wrong. so he naturally felt that he deserved God's deliverance. God's desire for God's deliverance was an indication of his natural desire for justice. Douglas realized that he was able to reason about the injustice of his condition as a slave, but because of this realization, Douglas concluded that God would also know the injustices of slavery and know how to execute justice. However, this was a turning point for Douglas because the moment he questioned the presence of God's justice, he realized that he was the one who needed to deliver himself. Furthermore, Douglas refused to accept his condition as a slave for life or even tolerate injustice during his life as a slave, especially when he fought one of his slave masters. Douglas's fight with Mr. Covey was another turning point which helped Douglas to take freedom into his own hands. Mr. Covey overworked Douglas to the point where Douglas could not leisurely exercise his intellect. Despite these harsh conditions, Douglas literally fought for his freedom. His victory revived the sense of his own manhood and inspired him again with a determination to be free. As a result of this fight, Douglas understood that he had the right to govern his own thoughts and actions, as well as the ability to order them to what was good. Freedom. After Douglas fought with Mr. Covey, he was sent to go work on Mr. Freeland's plantation. During his time with Mr. Freeland, Douglas was appalled by the inhumane practice of drunkenness among the slaves. On Christmas Day, the slave masters gave their slaves free time. However, the slave masters encouraged their slaves to use this so-called free time to get drunk. Douglas criticized the slaves' drunkenness as an inhumanity of slavery and as one of the grossest frauds committed upon the slave. The slaves were allowed to freely drink to their heart's content, but as a result, they lost the freedom to govern their actions. Therefore, the slaves were, as Douglas describes, cheated into thinking that there was little to choose between liberty and slavery. In other words, the slaves were maintained ignorant of the meaning of virtuous freedom. Douglas's commentary on the injustice of drunkenness emphasizes that virtuous freedom is not the opportunity to do whatever one wants. Rather, it is the opportunity and the leisure to do an activity which is good for oneself and for others. Douglas used this leisure time on Mr. Freeland's plantation to exercise virtue by educating his fellow slaves. Douglas began their education by creating in them a strong desire to read, a desire similar to the one Mr. Auld accidentally created in Douglas. He established his, quote, virtuous little Sabbath school, end quote. Here, Douglas taught other slaves how to read and write by spending their time, quote, trying to learn the will of God, end quote. He also educated his students about their own want of manhood and imbued their minds with thoughts of freedom. Douglas did not distort the meaning of virtuous freedom, but instead taught the slaves what it meant to practice virtue by giving them an education. From Douglas's own experience as a teacher and the progress of Douglas's students, we learn that intellectual freedom and virtuous freedom are dependent on each other and belong in a free society. Even though Douglas and his students could independently practice intellectual and virtuous freedom, they were unsatisfied with their condition as a slave. They lived in a society where this virtuous behavior was, of course, discouraged. After Douglas and his students were caught trying to escape from Mr. Freeland's bag, because his slave master allowed him to keep a part of his wages, his slave master actually realized that Douglas was entitled to the whole of his wages. And so Douglas concluded that Hugh Auld gave him a part of his wages in order to not feel guilty while he was still benefiting from slavery. And as Douglas reflected on Hugh Auld's desire to give him only a part of his wages, he finally understood the dignity of his work. Douglas desired to exercise the responsibilities of a free man in a secure society because he understood that in his capacity to think and work independently as a slave, he was a human being who was intellectually and virtuously free to govern himself. Consequently, Douglas eventually escaped slavery and with the help of his friend, Mr. David Ruggles, was able to safely prepare himself with his newly wed wife for the duties and responsibilities of a free life in New Bedford. Upon his arrival to New Bedford, Douglas was shocked by the strongest proofs of wealth and impressed by the amount of comfort, taste, and refinement in the houses, churches, and gardens. As a slave, Douglas assumed that the North was poorer than the South because he knew that the North didn't have any slaves. In addition to making an economic critique on the institution of slavery, Douglass was demonstrating how free labor is enriching to society and to its citizens. He writes, "Every man appeared to understand his work and went at it with a sober yet cheerful earnestness. He felt that in what he was doing, there was a sense of his own dignity as a man." Douglass, as a free man, was able to work with a sense of his own dignity. He explains that on the first day that he was employed as a free man, he worked with a pleasure he had never experienced before. As a free citizen, Douglass was finally accountable for his actions and thus politically free. However, he was not completely satisfied with his simple and comfortable life as a free man. Douglass not only continued to exercise his virtuous freedom by embracing the responsibilities of work, but continued to exercise his intellectual freedom by reading and thinking more about the issue of slavery. Douglass writes that the abolitionist paper became his meat and drink, and that they set his soul on fire. The very same effect these papers had on Douglass was and is the very same effect Douglass's narrative has on its readers. After being inspired by the abolitionist papers, Douglass was devoted to teaching and defending the truth about slavery. As a result of his life, he was involved in politics, he defended the rights of slaves, and identified the paradox of American slavery through many speeches and books. The true legacy of Frederick Douglass, however, is not his life as an abolitionist, nor is it his successful escape from slavery. It is his deep insight into the meaning of self-government, which he beautifully and artfully crafted into the account of his life as a slave. With his narrative, Douglass continues to uphold the greatest aspects of our human nature and of the human good: our ability to exercise our intellectual, virtuous, and political freedom as we learn, think, and work. His narrative teaches us that slavery fundamentally degrades our human nature and the sense of our dignity as men and women. In other words, slavery is the antithesis to self-government.
Okay, well, thank you. I really enjoyed reading through your thesis and thinking about that.
Good, I thought you were thinking of the tissue box.
Oh. I was struck by your division of freedom into three parts: the intellectual and the virtuous and political. And I thought that paralleled very nicely the account that Douglass gives of his life, so it seems apt to me. And I was thinking through those three parts of the division, and I was trying to get clear on the relationship between them. And so I went back to some of your definitions. I think you defined them at a couple of points, but maybe most concisely towards the end. So you talk about intellectual freedom as the opportunity to freely rationalize about the truth for oneself. And then you also talk about virtuous freedom as the leisure to exercise virtue. And the important parts of those seem to be rationalizing about the truth and exercising virtue, but I was actually wondering about the other parts. That in terms of intellectual freedom, you talk about it as an opportunity, and again, with virtuous freedom, you talk about it as a leisure. And I think you said a similar thing in the presentation. And that made me think that by that account, freedom seems to be, it creates the opportunity or the leisure, it sort of creates the space as a sort of condition for the pursuit of knowledge or for virtue or something like that. But you know where I'm going with this, don't you?
I think so.
Okay. So that makes it sound like freedom is a prerequisite for knowledge and virtue. Is that true?
Okay, what do you mean by prerequisite?
The words leisure and opportunity make it sound like freedom is a necessary condition for knowledge and also for virtue. That as if freedom is a way of attaining those things, or at least it's necessary for the attainment of those things.
And you don't think, I mean, wouldn't it be that knowledge and virtue are necessary for freedom?
Okay.
And not the other way around? I don't know, maybe it sounds like that. Because it seems to be that, it seems to be that when you're given freedom, in order to exercise it well and in a way that is actually free and liberating, you need to have knowledge and virtue. So you can have the freedom to do whatever you want, basically. I could just run out the store and go around the parking lot, like I don't want to do this anymore. But that wouldn't be exercising virtue, nor would I be exercising my knowledge in a way that was good. Does that answer your question? Or should I elaborate more?
I think it answers it. So that suggests that we could take freedom in at least a couple of different ways. And that, in one sense, we could take it as a sort of condition for those things, just the freedom to do whatever you want. Or we could take it in a more positive way, which seems to be what you're getting at in your thesis and what Douglas is saying. That instead of simply a sort of opportunity for something, it's more about the exercise of the virtue or the exercise of the knowledge itself.
Right, and I think Douglas would also say that it's not only, this opportunity, or the opportunity sort of includes a circumstance. So you need to be in a society which allows you to also exercise knowledge and to exercise virtue, because first off, it was illegal for slaves to learn, and it was illegal for slaves to teach other slaves. And then second off, practicing virtue was something that wasn't encouraged. As you can see, the slave masters wanted their slaves to get drunk, but then the way that they also punished their slaves, I wasn't able to talk about this in the thesis, but they whip them to the point where the slaves don't understand why they're being whipped. And so they don't understand what is right and what is wrong. And so the way that justice is exercised in that regime is justice that is deviant. So it's also very important in the society and the political regime in which you're exercising these freedoms. And I think Douglas would say that these freedoms can only be truly exercised in a certain regime, which is the regime that we see in New Bedford.
You go.
Yeah, I might ask a follow-up to that, but first I should say, nice job. It's a well-written thesis. You quote beautifully from the master, and the master writer. You've learned a lot from him, and so it's very impressive to see that. One question, just a sort of broad question I have for you is, what does Douglas say something, or has he taught you something that you think is controversial? That is, in other words, that people would say, hold on, really? Do I believe that? Is that true? Because all of this sounds like a very compelling account of what genuine virtue is, genuine self-government is, the necessity of freedom, both understood in a sort of freedom to act, but then this more deeper meaning of freedom. But anyways, yeah, what's controversial? What's provocative about?
Oh man, there's a lot of provocative things about Douglas, actually. One thing, I said this at the beginning of
Yeah, some things.
I just thought of something, but I think one of the provocative things about Douglas, and one thing that's very unsettling, is that this was an extremely unique circumstance for him. So then you start asking questions. Can everyone really practice virtuous freedom? Does everybody really have the capacity to exercise their intellect? If you just look at his life, I mean, not only were these circumstances extremely unique, that he was just chosen from his plantation, and some people speculate that the reason why he was chosen was because he was somehow related to one of the slave masters. But the fact that he was, if we just look at the fact that he listens to this conversation between Sophia and Hugh Hall, And then from that conversation, he's able to understand the pathway to freedom and the white man's power to enslave the black man. Like, and he hasn't even read a book about the injustices of slavery, and he's already able to pick up on that. And I think that's very impressive, but it also shows that there's something unique about him. And sometimes I wonder, when I was reading his book, he was extremely determined to keep going, even though he was extremely depressed, even though he wanted to commit suicide at one point. And I think that indicates that what would happen to other slaves if they knew the truth about their condition? Would they commit suicide? Would they have the strength and determination to keep going? And so, I guess, to sum it up again, one of the provocative things about Frederick Douglass is that his narrative, his life seems to be extremely unique. And I guess that raises the question, how applicable is this to my own life? Although I still think we can learn a lot from his life.
Is the uncomfortable thing that you're pointing to the thought that only a few people can genuinely exercise freedom in the virtuous way that Frederick Douglass was capable of? Is that?
Yes, perhaps that is a better way.
I don't know if I want to. Let me ask you a slightly different question. A famous debate in the black community after the Civil War was, how should blacks integrate themselves into society? So the two famous positions are Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And so one says, look, it's bad for you, it's unhealthy to constantly dwell on injustice, an injustice that's been committed against you. It's better to be self-reliant and sort of ignore the fact that there are serious disadvantages that your people might have suffered. So the self-reliant teaching is the Washington teaching. Du Bois says, now that maybe sounds nice, but gosh, isn't that naive? We suffer, and there are serious limitations imposed upon us, especially because we don't have basic equal political rights, especially, of course, in the Jim Crow South. So, and that demands a real sense of anger at injustice and fighting it, and a requirement to fight it. So my question is, do you have a sense of where Douglass might stand in this debate, how he might referee the debate, and does he have a third alternative? What's a healthy way to approach the problem of injustice?
Well, so I don't know if you've read this speech, but he says it's Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," and it's amazing. I love it. But I think Douglass actually lies in the middle. I think on one hand, he didn't agree with the way in which the abolitionist movement as a whole was being executed. He was an abolitionist leader, but I was actually at the beginning very hesitant to even call him an abolitionist because he didn't like the fact that there was a lot of people going around banging everybody over the head with the Bible, telling them this is a sin, this is terrible, you shouldn't do this. And I think one of the reasons why that bothers him a lot is because, first off, you're not really reasoning with anybody and you're not talking to them about this issue. And then second off, the Southerners had their own religious arguments for slavery. So, but at the same time, if we look at Douglass's life, the fact that he's writing a speech called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," he is very, very concerned about the rights of the slaves. He's very concerned about racial prejudice. And I think it's very fair to say that he's just one of the best civil rights thinkers, one of the best just American thinkers about rights in general. And
I would definitely say that he had a more moderate, but rational, very rational approach to this issue. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it begins to, but would you spell out what you mean by the moderation of his position?
So what I mean by the moderation of his position is that even though he's extremely rhetorical, he's not, I don't know how to explain it. He's not using violence as a means to deal with the issue of racial prejudice. Instead, he's using his reason as a way to talk about this political issue.
Good job, Mary. So you're, like Mr. Burnt, I'm intrigued by your division of freedom into 3 parts. That's very interesting. I think it's very compelling. I note that in a well-written, thoughtful paper about what it means to be free and what it means to moderate oneself and acquire virtue, there's not a lot of explicit discussion of the passions. I think you have thought a lot about it, even though you don't write a lot about it. So I want to delve a little bit more into that question of how the passions are all related to this. So maybe you could talk about the free time on Christmas as an example.
Yes, I'm about to
You're already there.
pull up that page.
So maybe you already know what I'm going to ask.
Maybe, I don't know actually.
Okay, let me try to ask it.
Yeah, ask it.
You can tell
Go
me if
for
it's
it.
what you think. What I was going to ask is, can you explain why that experience of getting drunk, you said something very interesting. It makes these people confused between liberty and slavery.
And that's quoting directly from Douglas.
Yeah, good. And my sense is that the passions would be involved somehow in that, and I'm wondering if you can explain how they are involved.
So when you mean by passions, can you clarify?
Yes.
Passions.
I mean the non-rational part of the soul.
The non-rational part of the soul. Okay, great. Maybe I can begin by saying this. So if we're talking in Aristotelian terms, which seems like we are, which is not a bad thing. It's a great thing. It seems to me then that we would.
Don't act like this is your first time around the Aristotle block.
Oh yeah, actually, I brought my Aristotle with me because I knew. I'm gonna ask. I got it right there. But anyway, it seems to be that the intellectual freedom is something that. So the first part of the soul is the reason, and so Frederick Douglass cultivates his reason with his education, and he realizes that now he has the freedom to think for himself. He doesn't have somebody telling him what to do or telling him, actually don't think about your condition as a slave. He's saying no, I'm going to think about my dignity, I'm going to think about my condition as a slave, I'm going to read books, I'm going to try to understand myself and what this is. And then for virtuous freedom, he is, or the slaves, or he's trying to learn how to control his passions. And so one of these passions, I don't know what you're asking, or if this is really answering your question, but I guess when you're drunk, it's more of this pleasure. So you're drinking because it's pleasant. Can you ask another question, or I don't know if the guide me to know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is, what is it about drunkenness that makes one confused about the desirability of liberty over slavery?
Yeah.
And does that have anything to do with the passions, or is there something else at work there?
Okay, I see. So drunkenness, when you're drunk, this actually has to do more with the intellectual freedom. I see what you're saying. When you're drunk, you can't think straight. And when you're drunk, what happens is that afterwards, you're like, great, I can't control myself. I don't know what moderation is. And so since these slaves can't control themselves and they can't think straight, they fall into the temptation of thinking that, again, there's little to choose between freedom and slavery. Because drunk, they think, okay, I have the freedom to drink as much as I want. I have the freedom to celebrate. But then they realize, wait a second, I don't actually know how to control myself. I actually have to depend on somebody else. And what I thought was freedom just turns out to be another form of slavery. I'm now a slave to my passions because they're not just drunk, can't think straight. So I wonder if Douglas is implying that perhaps drunkenness is just another form of slavery that the slave masters endure on the slave. There's another instance that I didn't talk about, but what happens is that what the slave masters would do sometimes is that they would tempt their slaves. So they would do specific things so their slaves would steal. So he gives an example of a master coming back from the town and having a giant jar of molasses and just allowing the slave to just take some and steal some. And so when he sees that the slave steals some, he punishes the slave by making the slave eat as much molasses as he can until he gets really, really sick. And so, in a way, it's really strange. It's like how the slave masters sort of understand the psychology of their slaves. But it's almost like they want to trick their slaves or get their slaves to think that they can't control themselves.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I think we now have time for questions from the audience. Mary, can you just call out as you
Oh, Emily.
So you said in part one about how he started to realize, seemed like he became more intellectual in the sense like he started to realize his certification. And can you just clarify what you meant by as he began to learn more, he just like hadn't learned it at all?
Oh, yes. So, I guess I can kind of confusing. Okay. So you're confused. I just want to make sure that I know what you're confused about so that I'm not saying something that you already know. You're confused about the fact that he kind of cultivates his intellectual virtue. He has his education, but then he doesn't want it anymore.
Yeah, in a sense. I just want need clarification. I'm not confused. I just want like black and white.
How did that happen? Or
like just run me through it again. So I can
okay. So what happened is that he listened to this conversation between Sophia and Thomas Ald, and he was Hugald, pardon me, and he was provoked by the fact that they were telling him you shouldn't be educated, and so that provocation allowed him to realize, wait a second, there's something wrong here, and so he's like, I'm going to educate myself now, and as he's educating himself, he, again, this goes back to the uniqueness of Douglas, so happens to find this dialogue between a slave and a master. It's not until he reads this dialogue that he understands that there's an injustice in slavery. Again, the bold enunciation of human.
Very rhetorical, kind of angry, but it sounds like there's some kind of clarity for him in that moment.
Yes, so I guess one thing I should say, I did realize that in my thesis I might make Douglas sound like a pagan, but he's not. I think he's somewhat of like a non-denominational Christian, perhaps, and actually in the beginning of his book, I don't know what to take with this. I don't know if this is him being rhetorical or if he actually means it, but he actually thanks God for the opportunity of being able to go work in Baltimore. And I think in that monologue is sort of calling out for God's deliverance just indicates something natural about human beings, that we naturally long for, I don't think I mentioned this, an omniscient and omnipotent being, and we long for justice. And I think, especially because he was like, okay, I was able to reason about this injustice. If there has to be some sort of higher being, he's hoping for some sort of higher being that is also just. But then he's expecting that this higher being who is just, who would see, okay, there is this man in this unjust predicament, would help him get out of it.
So it was not enough for him to kind of know something and still be stuck. It seems like the motivating factor was the actual body is moving, like where his actual movement in his existence is after this point of this kind of argument with God. Because
Yes.
in this place, he's been thinking about freedom, he's been reading about freedom, he's mad about it, and now, in this moment, this is the moment that's stimulating actual, like an action outside.
Yes. So, yes, because what happens, and what I was, I think, trying to do with that was sort of indicate that he, like, picks up his intellectual freedom again, because he's, like, broken.
Okay.
And he's physically exhausted, and he's so physically exhausted to the point where he just lies around and stops thinking. He loses his determination to, again, continue his education and pursue freedom. And so he again kind of stoops down to sort of depression. But it's because he starts asking these questions, and again, sort of re-exercising his intellectual freedom that he has cultivated, and it's I guess, it's just a capacity that he has with slaves. He is able to, again, as you were saying, pick himself up against action.
So does that, in this case, would you say that Douglas believes that freedom carries responsibility?
Most definitely, yes, of course, yes.
And how does that seem in that?
So there is this other passage that I was going to talk about, but I didn't, and I think my panel has it, but responsibility seems to be a subtle theme, especially when we see how the slave masters exercise their own knowledge and virtue. And he sees how they are irresponsible with the knowledge that they use because they use it as a way to maintain other slaves ignorant. But I think, I wonder how this relates back to the monologue.
I think justice, so like this justice that's higher than just the justice that he sees, right? So there's something that's motivating. So if there's freedom,
right?
If freedom carries responsibility, then we must act.
Yes, but I think in this case, he's taking that responsibility into his own hands, and then he also uses that responsibility to educate the other slaves. Oh, beat the
I have a question.
You were there, you saw me. Well, believe it or not, I finished it today for lunch. I don't know. We'll have to count when we get home.
Still working on it.
Yeah. Juliana.
So when you were talking about how the slave masters kind of took advantage of their slaves, I think you said their psychology and were aware of that. Do you think that they're aware of all of Douglas's idea of freedom too? Do you think that they did those specific things to? Do you think they knew these ideas, or do you think this was a completely new breakthrough that Douglas found? Or do you think that they were actively like taking advantage?
Okay, this is a good question because I thought about it too. And I mean, on one hand, we see that Sophia all just like innocently starts teaching Douglas. So she doesn't realize that, oh, I should, maintain the slave ignorance. So there seems to be something that's a little perverse, something that's off in their understanding of human nature and of a relationship between a slave and a master. Because I think when she probably sees Douglas, she's probably saying, like, oh, it's just another human being, it's just another kid, and it's probably just out of her motherly nature. She's like, I just want to educate him and teach him. But then at the same time, she's very easily convinced that I have to maintain him ignorant, that I have to keep him in a, Douglas calls it a mental darkness. And so Douglas does this contrast where at first she paints her like this very beautiful angel, like beautiful smile, and then she turns into this like demon who's like trying to prevent him from learning. And I think that sort of shows that there's something also about our human nature that desires a sort of power. Because Douglas does call education kind of power, especially power from slavery to freedom. And so it seems to be like the slave masters. I think Hugh All especially understood that if I don't do these certain things to a slave, he's going to rebel. And it makes a lot of sense. Because as I was saying, if the slave starts thinking, because he has an education, wait a second, is this just? Why is it that you can reason about things and you can just live life, you can earn your own wages, you don't have to be beaten over the back for doing something wrong? And once you start thinking, that again starts motivating you to action. And that's what the slave masters fear. It's just like a slave rebellion because all these slaves realize that, oh shoot, this isn't just, and this is terrible, and this is not the life that we should have. And so I think the slave masters really recognize that an ignorant slave is a happy slave, good working slave. Don't know what their life is. They're living a life. And it's easier to control somebody who is living a lie.
Yeah, so it's like the cave complex, and they just
Yes! Oh my god, it's totally like the cave. And I wanted to reference Plato, but I was told not to. Because Douglas probably never read Plato. But it's just like the same experience, because when he comes out of the cave, like the light blinds him and it's so painful. Yes. Great. I'm so glad you understand. Okay, so Anna, and then I'll go to you.
Okay, so I have a question about that third part of the thesis, the political freedom. So, do you think you could clarify that? Because Frederick Douglass obviously had some sort of political career afterwards. I don't know if he held office, but I guess he went around giving speeches. So, if everyone is supposed to kind of like come into these different freedoms, like what role do we have in politics if maybe we're not going to run an office, or is that the goal? Is that sort of the highest freedom we can have? Like, I don't know. Maybe
I can see how you can think political freedom just means being involved in politics, because that is what Douglas's life looks like. But I think with political freedom, it's being in a society where you can freely and accountably follow the rule of law. So the laws are just, and you can follow them, and so not only are you punished for breaking them, but you're also in a way rewarded for doing things that are good. And so when you're politically free, you're in a regime where you can truly exercise your intellectual freedom and your virtuous freedom. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go out and be an activist, but I think with Douglas in particular, he just wasn't satisfied with the fact that it's like, oh, I'm here at home and I'm free now. And I think that also indicates, again, sort of uniqueness about himself, and I think he recognized that I'm unique and I almost have a responsibility and a duty to my fellow brethren in bonds, as he says, and to help them come out of slavery, because he recognizes, like, you're smart, you
so like virtuous and intellectual freedom should be one to try and maybe if the regime is not just maybe change that.
change
Take
that.
some part of
Yes.
reforming it.
Yes.
And if it is to live correctly, not just machines.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Can you just tell me your name again? I'm
I'm
sorry.
Seth.
Seth?
Yeah. Okay. So I have a question.
Yes.
Is slavery always wrong? in every single case, because people like George Washington owned tons of slaves, but we don't consider them to be bad people. So is slavery always wrong in every single case because you're keeping people captive?
Love this question so much. Awesome. Oh my gosh. I don't even know where to start. Okay. I'm like looking at the founders right now. Alright. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson. It's very interesting. I don't know if you guys know, but yeah, I have it in here. He writes this letter where he talks about slavery and he talks about how it's a problem, but he also says that, you know, blacks were like less intellectual naturally. I don't know what to make of that. Some people like to say that he's a racist. I think that's kind of fair. I wouldn't say that our founders are bad. This is something that I learned with Mr. O'Toole, that their writings are extraordinary. And I think Douglas even appreciated the founders as well, and he recognized that the principles that they laid down for our natural rights and for our political freedom were true and good. And I don't think Douglas would necessarily say that they were bad men. I just think, and this is something that, again, I've learned from Mr. O'Toole, that there's just a temptation. We have temptations as human beings. So, and I'll get to answering your question whether slavery is just in all cases, because it's an extremely good question. But I think for the sake of defending the founders, I don't think they were necessarily bad. I just think, especially Jefferson saw that owning slaves is nice. I mean, he was an aristocrat. He could live however he wanted. If he didn't have slaves, he would have been in debt. I don't know if you know, but he has a really nice house. He was able to make really nice experiments. He actually had an affair with one of the slaves. Do you have something to add?
I would like to ask if you have read Jefferson's Wolf by the Ears.
I think it's in here, actually, and I can't find it. But yes, I have. Because I was gonna get to that, because it's ironic, because at the same time, he says that slavery is dangerous, and that it was something that was going to have to be eventually eradicated. And so there's just, I don't know, there's a bit of a paradox with Jefferson's life, especially when we compare what he said in his public life versus what he actually practiced in his private life. So that's what I'm just going to say to the founders. But then with your question as to whether slavery is wrong in all cases, this is when things get really controversial, because in a way, and I think this is something that we kind of see in Aristotle, and if I'm misquoting him, please correct me, because you got to be the Aristotelian expert. It seems to be that children, in a way, are slaves, because, I know everyone's like, what? Go ahead, let me explain. Because, and my siblings are like, I'm going to kill you, basically. But in a way, they can't reason for themselves. And so they need a sort of guidance. You need somebody to teach you how to use your restroom. You need somebody to teach you how to eat your food well. Because if you don't, you're going to choke on yourself. I don't know. It's an example. Maybe not the best example, but it seems to be that people can be slaves in the sense that they're dependent on other human beings. I think even Aristotle goes so far to say even disabled people, just because they don't have those mental and rational faculties, and they're just maybe driven by their passions, they need somebody else to reason and to guide them. And so maybe in that sense, but that'd be, I don't know, it seems to be saying that I'm saying that like education is a form of slavery. But slavery is good or okay. But is it okay to use and abuse and manipulate another rational human being? Most definitely not.
Okay, so I have a question, another question.
Good, that's great.
So,
I love questions.
in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, it refers to America as like this, a young America as this child, and if a child doesn't know how they act, so he goes on to say that when America started, it was a child to England and it needed their support. But it goes on to say that now America is no longer a child and it doesn't need England's support, and that's why they break up. So do you think that America is being hypocritical of owning slaves when they think that it's wrong to control something after it's all grown up?
So good. Why aren't you in my government class? Wait, I almost fell over. This is awesome. We talk about this in government all the time. This is great. Actually, this gets even better. Thomas Jefferson, the guy who owned slaves, actually in the Declaration of Independence, or was it the Constitution? Declaration of Independence, wrote or tried to eradicate slaves and tried to get rid of slavery. But then after talking with John Adams, I guess, or
He listed it as one of the injustices
Yes.
that the Crown had inflicted.
There we go.
As implying that this was a great problem.
yes.
Yeah, they had to strike it though, because some sort of.
Right, because then the southern states wouldn't have joined, and so they did it as a compromise, but all the founders understood that slavery was unjust and was hypocritical to their principles that they had set down, and they were hoping that, with time, slavery would be eradicated, but then of course you have the invention of the cotton gin, where slavery became a lot more popular, and of course, Civil War. Does that answer your question, Seth?
Yeah.
You should stop by the 12th grade class.
Can I make a couple comments of clarification on this question?
Sure, yeah,
Um,
because you're smart.
You're saying some really good things. I just think it'd be helpful for people to
Yes.
know
Go
some of
for
the
it.
things you're alluding to. The Jefferson statement is I think a very powerful one. So folks in the audience probably, I recommend you read it. It's from the Notes on the State of Virginia. One thing he says there is that the great injustice of slavery is that it both degrades the master and the slave.
Yes.
And then he says, I tremble when I fear that God is just, predicting that eventually there will be a justified slave war, or a racial war in which the slaves revolt. That's not exactly what happened with the Civil War, but it seems to me that Jefferson is clear there in understanding that slavery is at odds with the principles of the Declaration of the Foundation of the Government. And from one thing we talked about in our government classes, all of the founders understood this. There was a mistake when people say that all men are created equal, they meant all white men or all white males are created equal. Now that doesn't necessarily excuse hypocrisy on their part or giving in to temptations, which is what you've mentioned that Jefferson did to live a sort of life
I mean, I learned that from you.
indulgence.
I have
Yeah.
that exact same question at the beginning of the year, which I just think is ironic.
Well, I just thought that would be a helpful point of clarification. The other thing I thought might be helpful is Aristotle's point on this is that slavery is only justified in extremely rare circumstance and case. And that's something like raising children or taking care of somebody who suffers from some serious mental disability. But in that case, it's really because it's good for the natural slave.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because you want to extract or exploit that person for their labor. In Aristotle's, what he kind of shows is anybody who would make a really good slave, it's not just to enslave them.
Okay, great. I did not know that.
So I think that's the point there. Implicitly showing the great injustice of the vast majority of slavery as practiced in the world. But now a question for you on this, and then I do think your mother had a question,
Yes.
which would be important to ask. But
Poor
you
mother.
alluded to you alluded to the 4th of July speech, and it seems to me that's relevant to all of this. So what does Douglas say to about the founders and?
So, yeah, it's a great speech. I love it so much. It's funny because I think it was like a few months ago, Mr. Gary was like, hey, have you read this like really cool speech? And of course. But anyway, I just want to say this one question, and he says this at the beginning, and it's amazing. And he says, are the greatest of political
are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulted from your independence to us? And so, just by reading that second to third question that he asks, I think we realize that he understood what the founders wrote, respected what the founders wrote, and even like, I mean, how to say this? He agreed with the writings of the founders, and he agreed with the Declaration of the Independence, and he even understood that this was something that applied to him, and, well, to everyone, really. I mean, I don't know, that seems kind of obvious. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. I mean, he definitely respected the founders and understood that the founders thought that slavery was unjust. And I think that's just something that we not only see in his narrative, but we also see in his arguments for civil rights among Black people and among everyone. I mean, this is why he supported women's suffrage. He also understood that these rights are not only extended to white men, they're also extended to white women, they're extended to Black women, they're extended to everyone. So, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
You have time for one more question.
Really? No. Okay, yeah, that goes to my mom.
Well, I don't know if it's a question, but it was going back to Esther's question about the dialogue that he has and that he's angry with God. And that it's his turning point. Is it because he realizes that it's not God's injustice, but it's man's injustice, and that's why he's able to say, if this is something that man did, this is something that man can undo, or something?
Yes, so I think for that part, it's more his invocation to God. I don't know if that necessarily reveals anything about his relationship with God or what he thinks about God. I think it might reveal more about his natural longing for God, and I think later in his life he might have developed a kind of relationship with God, but he also, I think, realizes that when he first realizes the sort of injustice of his condition as a slave, he immediately gets mad at the slave masters. And so he blames the slave masters for degrading the slaves. I don't think we ever see him explicitly say, oh, God allowed this to happen to me. I think he realizes that he attributes the injustice that is incurred upon him to the slave masters.
I think both my question and yours, it's not necessarily about his devotional relationship to God, like so personal, does he have a personal relationship to God? It's an understanding that in order to go beyond something, there has to be a foundational justice, right? So recognizing that injustice of man. So there's a higher justice. There's a higher thing that can spur me to action so God, like a principle of all things. So whether or not he has a kind of his personal relationship to God, it seems like that what happens in that moment is bumping against like a fundamental truth, right? In a way, of God, like who's going to? So when you kind of like when you're in a difficulty, you're going to go to that next person. If you bump to this person, well, this person isn't. So then I'm going to go to the next person. I'm going to go to the next person. Don't you hit a certain kind of like this is fundamental? You see what I mean?
See. I think, so he goes from sort of asking for God's deliverance and saying, okay, God, will you let me be free? And then I think he realizes that, you know what, in a way, he realizes that God won't be able to deliver him. And so he realizes that he's the one who actually needs to take freedom again into his own hands and pursue his own freedom instead of just sitting around and depending on God to help him. So, and after that monologue, he says, and you will see how a man, or like you will see how a fruit was transformed back into a man. Or something like that. I'm trying to find it. But I don't know if that answers your question. If you guys, I don't know, it's like 5 o'clock too, so. Yeah, I mean, we can talk afterwards, for sure.